The atmosphere in Washington that morning was unusually tense. The Grand Hall of the Capitol was packed with lawmakers, journalists, students, and activists. A nationally televised forum on the future of American democracy was about to begin, featuring an unlikely pairing, former President Bill Clinton and freshman Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Cameras panned across the audience as they murmured with anticipation. Many were curious about what Clinton, an elder statesman with decades of political experience, would say to or about the fiery new face of Congress. Crockett had built a reputation for sharp comebacks, fearless defense of her principles, and an ability to command a crowd. When Clinton took the stage, applause filled the room. Though older, his charisma hadn't faded. He waved warmly, smiled, and launched into his opening remarks. America, he began, is at a crossroads. We need unity, maturity, and respect if we are to rebuild faith in our institutions. Too often, I see younger leaders using anger instead of wisdom, heat instead of light. And I fear that passion without discipline may destroy the very progress we've made. The audience listened carefully. Clinton then shifted his tone, his eyes narrowing slightly. And let me be candid, he said, pausing for effect, Representative Jasmine Crockett embodies this challenge. She is brilliant, yes. Passionate, yes. But her confrontational style, her constant sparring, and her unwillingness to compromise, well, these things risk tearing us apart rather than bringing us together. Gasps rippled through the hall. Clinton had not only criticized a sitting member of Congress but had done so directly, without sugarcoating. The camera immediately cut to Crockett, seated in the front row, her chin lifted, her eyes unflinching. Clinton continued, leadership requires patience, humility, and restraint. I worry that if we confuse noise for progress, we will end up with neither. That is why I urge younger politicians like Representative Crockett to rethink their approach. America needs builders, not demolition crews. The hall grew silent. Clinton, satisfied with the weight of his words, nodded and stepped back from the podium. The moderator then announced, and now, we welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to the stage. The crowd erupted in applause, not just out of politeness but in anticipation. They knew she would not let this moment pass without a response. Crockett walked with purpose toward the microphone, her bright blazer catching the lights, her steps firm and deliberate. She paused before speaking, letting the silence build, her eyes meeting those of the audience, then turning toward Clinton. Mr. President, she began, her voice calm yet sharp, I appreciate your service to this country. No one here denies your legacy. But when you say I am too loud, too fiery, too unwilling to compromise, what I hear is the same critique that has been leveled against every woman, every black leader, every young voice who dared to speak truth to power. The audience stirred. She continued, you say America needs builders. But tell me, how do you build a house on a rotten foundation? You don't patch up broken beams with politeness. You don't cover cracks in the wall with charm. You tear it down, brick by brick, and rebuild it stronger. That is not destruction, that is survival. The hall erupted into applause, cheers echoing so loudly the moderator had to signal for calm. Clinton shifted in his chair, his expression tight but intrigued. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone, her tone rising with conviction. You want to talk about patience. My people have been patient for centuries. You want to talk about restraint. We've restrained our voices, our anger, our dreams, while waiting for promises of equality that never came. And now, when we finally demand change, not tomorrow, not 10 years from now, but today, you call it noise. The crowd roared again, several standing to clap. Journalists' pens flew across their notepads, and cameras zoomed in on Clinton, whose smile had faded into a contemplative frown. Crockett's eyes scanned the audience, then locked back onto Clinton. You built bridges in your time. I respect that. But I am here to build doors, doors that open for those who have been shut out, locked out, ignored, dismissed. If my voice shakes the walls of this institution, then maybe those walls needed shaking. This time, the ovation was thunderous, the sound rolling through the chamber like a wave. People stamped their feet, some shouting her name. Clinton, despite himself, let out a small chuckle and shook his head. For the first time, he seemed less like an adversary and more like a man impressed by the fire he had just witnessed. Crockett straightened her blazer, leaned into the mic one last time, and said, So Mr. President, with all due respect, If the choice is between being silent to keep the peace or being loud to demand justice, I choose loud. Every single time the hall exploded, people leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, whistling. The sound was deafening, and even the moderators couldn't contain the energy. The cameras zoomed in on Crockett's determined face, then cut back to Clinton, who, after a long pause, stood and began clapping slowly himself. It was a moment destined for headlines. The applause lingered long after Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the microphone. Even the moderators struggled to regain control as the audience fed off the electricity in the room. It wasn't just a speech, it was a statement, a declaration that echoed far beyond the walls of the Capitol. News outlets were already cutting live feeds into breaking news segments. Pundits on cable TV were scrambling to frame what had just happened, a former president publicly challenging a freshman congresswoman, only to be met with one of the most blistering rebuttals in recent memory. Backstage, the mood was equally charged. Clinton, escorted by aides, walked slowly toward the green room, deep in thought. Despite his criticism of Crockett, there was a hint of admiration in his eyes. He had been in politics long enough to know the difference between empty bluster and authentic conviction. Crockett, he realized, was no lightweight. Meanwhile, Crockett was swarmed by staffers, supporters, and young activists who hugged her, shook her hand, and whispered words of encouragement. Phones buzzed with notifications. Hashtags bearing her name were already trending across social media. Clips of her fiery words were going viral on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter within minutes. One particularly powerful moment, the line, "If my voice shakes the walls of this institution, then maybe those walls needed shaking," was replayed over and over, often set to triumphant background music. The private exchange. A few minutes later, Clinton requested a private word with her. At first, Crockett hesitated. Part of her bristled at the idea of giving ground so soon after standing her own. But she eventually agreed. The two met in a small lounge, away from cameras, with only a single aide standing at the door. Clinton broke the silence first. "You've got fire, Congresswoman. Reminds me of a few folks I once knew, maybe even myself when I was your age," he said with a weary smile. Crockett crossed her arms, her voice steady. "With all due respect, Mr. President, fire doesn't burn just for show. It burns because something needs to change." Clinton chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But remember, change requires more than speeches. It requires strategy, coalitions, patience. And," Crockett shot back, "it requires courage to call out what's wrong, even when it makes people uncomfortable." The two locked eyes for a long moment, a silent recognition passing between them. Clinton, seasoned by decades of political battles, saw in her the same hunger that once drove him. Crockett, in turn, recognized that while he was an elder statesman, he wasn't blind to the truths she carried. Finally, Clinton extended his hand. "We may not agree on style, but I respect your fight. Just, don't let the fire consume you." Crockett hesitated, then shook his hand firmly. "And don't mistake my fire for recklessness. It's focus. It's fuel." The media frenzy. By evening, every network led with the confrontation. CNN's headline read, "Crockett vs. Clinton, a generational clash shakes Washington." Fox News framed it differently, "Disrespect or defiance." Crockett's heated retort to Clinton sparks debate. On MSNBC, commentators praised Crockett for refusing to be silenced. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like #Crockett vs. Clinton and #ChooseLoud. Young voters in particular embraced her stance. Memes spread rapidly, images of Crockett with captions like, "If the walls are shaking, democracy is working," and "Loud for justice," every single time. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. One quipped, "Bill Clinton told Jasmine Crockett to calm down, and she basically said, 'Sir, calm has left the chat.'" The audience roared. A shift in the narrative. Within days, Crockett's profile had skyrocketed. Donations to her campaign surged. College campuses invited her for speaking engagements. Activist groups used her speech as rallying material. But not everyone was pleased. Critics accused her of disrespecting a former president. Some older lawmakers whispered that she was too radical or too brash. Crockett, however, didn't flinch. In an interview with a national newspaper, she explained, "I wasn't elected to be quiet. I wasn't elected to keep the peace at the expense of justice." I was elected to represent people whose voices have been ignored for far too long. If that makes some uncomfortable, good. Change is never comfortable. Her words resonated deeply with younger generations who had grown disillusioned with politics as usual. Clinton's reflection. In the weeks that followed, Clinton himself addressed the exchange during a university lecture. "Look," he said, "I may not agree with every word Congresswoman Crockett said. But I'll tell you this," she reminded us of something important. Democracy isn't supposed to be quiet. It's supposed to be loud, messy, passionate. And maybe, just maybe, this next generation is exactly what we need to shake us out of complacency. The audience applauded. Even critics of Crockett had to admit, if Bill Clinton himself was softening his stance, maybe her words had struck deeper than anyone realized. Epilogue. Months later, Crockett stood once again in the Capitol, this time addressing a packed committee hearing. The clip of her showdown with Clinton was still circulating online, still inspiring. She smiled briefly at the thought. It wasn't just about that one moment. It was about what it represented, a turning point where the old guard and the new clashed, and where her voice proved it could not be dismissed. As she began her testimony, she remembered the final line that had shaken the hall and echoed across the nation. "If the choice is between being silent to keep the peace or being loud to demand justice, I choose loud." Every single time. And this time, the whole country was listening.